Christmas for my family might be similar to most other families. My wife and I told our son that Santa brings gifts on Christmas Eve. And then on Christmas morning, we wake our son up and let him open those gifts. It's a very typical Christmas. So of course, on Christmas Eve, my son wanted to bake cookies for Santa, and we left a small plate next to a cup of milk before I told him to go to bed. Then, after waiting for an hour to make sure he was asleep, I started putting all the gifts under the tree. After finishing stacking them, I went to the small coffee table and grabbed a few bites of the cookies that were supposed to be made. It seemed like Santa came with satisfaction with my work. I turned off all the lights and joined my wife in bed. The next morning, my wife woke up our son, and he ran downstairs to open his gifts. He was so excited, shouting that Santa came. I always loved seeing his reaction to the gifts, but that ended after about an hour when he went to play with his new toys. And my wife and I started cleaning up the wrapping paper in the box. But that's when I noticed the cookies were gone. Actually, all the cookies were missing. We had prepared a full plate, and I only ate one, puzzled. I walked over to my wife and asked her about it, even though I knew she had been in bed the whole time. She laughed at me and joked as if I had eaten the whole plate, but her smile faded when she realized my concern. I approached my son and asked him if he had cookies this morning, but his answer only made me scared and more confused. He said he saw Santa eating them last night. Of course, I asked him what he meant, and he replied that he woke up in the middle of the night and saw someone eating the cookies. I remained calm in front of him, making sure not to reveal the big secret because he was only 6 years old. But now I'm very worried because it seems my wife too. This is a strange, absurd situation. But the reality is indeed scary, knowing there is someone in our house. I glanced upstairs, then searched the main floor before going to the basement. Honestly, I hadn't been in the basement for months. It was unfinished, small, and dirty in the year before we had our house. Washer and dryer were moved from the basement to the ground floor because we had no reason to go down there. So we just left it as an empty storage space. I opened the door and turned on the dim light. I waited a few seconds before descending, thinking that if someone was there, they would make themselves known without any other sound. I descended into the basement. From my initial glance, I didn't see anything extraordinary, just boxes and dust as leftovers. But looking closer, the stack of boxes seemed oddly put together, reminding me of when I was a child and would stack boxes to make forts or walls. I took a few steps closer before I could hear heavy breathing sounds from behind the wall of boxes. I froze in place out of shock and fear, hoping whoever was there would remain hidden so I could calmly go back upstairs and call the police. I wasn't that lucky, though. A disgusting, middle-aged, skinny man stood and stared directly into my eyes. I was so surprised that I didn't even move until the man quickly started climbing those boxes. I turned around and ran as fast as I could up the stairs. His steps were not far behind mine as I pushed through the threshold and slammed the door behind me, catching a glimpse of the man just a few steps below. I turned the lock and barricaded the door with a chair nearby. My wife screamed and panicked due to the chaos of the situation. She grabbed our son and ran upstairs while I stood near the door and called the police. Ironically, because my first thought when dialing 911 was how terrible I felt having to call someone on Christmas morning. Once again, my family's lives were in danger as I waited for the police to arrive. The man tried to persuade me to let him go, and that he meant no harm. At one point, he even sounded like he did. Talking to himself, the man sounded crazy. I almost felt sorry for him when the officers finally managed to apprehend him easily, and we filed a report trying not to let this ruin the rest of Christmas. But it was difficult to get back into the festive mood. It turns out he had been squatting in our basement for a few days to a few weeks, He had taken some of our food and drinks while we were gone, which made me feel sick remembering back. I even remembered things missing. Silly things like the last granola bar missing, and everyone claiming it wasn't them. This is just the usual thing you brush off as someone else, other than someone living in your house and stealing your food. Now I feel a bad feeling in my heart every time something is missing. I remember the creepy man staring at me and chasing me out of the basement. Christmas has always been a big event for my family. Every year, we would go to my aunt and uncle's house, where I could meet all my cousins as well as my grandparents. There was one year I couldn't stop thinking about many things, because something unexpected happened. I was only 10 years old at the time, and I was a relatively shy child, so meeting new people wasn't enjoyable at all for me that year. However, when we arrived at my uncle's house, my oldest cousin introduced us all to her boyfriend, Drew. Apparently, they had been together for a few years, and everything was getting very serious, so she wanted the whole family to feel comfortable with him. From what I heard, they met at the campus where they both attended college, which wasn't far away. But Drew was from overseas, so my uncle offered him to stay at their house for the winter holiday for a few days. I remember avoiding him as much as possible. I really didn't want to talk to a stranger I didn't know, and I certainly didn't want him to act like my older brother. However, my 6-year-old brother kept talking to him as if they had just become best friends in 2 days. My parents thought it was cute that my brother admired him, but to me, it was strange. I didn't know anything about it. It just made me feel uncomfortable at night. I shared a room with my brother, and I assumed Drew and my cousin shared a room on the other side of the house. I asked my little brother while we were getting ready why he liked Drew so much, and he only talked about how cool he was. He indeed was. I didn't really know what to expect from my 6-year-old brother, but when he answered, it crossed my mind that I should wonder why Drew was so eager to talk to my brother, not the other way around. I knew it all sounded like it was put into a bad context, when it could just be that I would soon become a loving brother-in-law. But it was only a feeling in my heart that told me something was off. And just a few days after we arrived on Christmas Eve, my intuition proved to be correct. I specifically remember that night's sleep and noticing my brother had much more energy than he should have had that night. I thought it was because he was excited about Christmas morning like I was too, and I went to sleep soon after. Hours later, I woke up, not knowing what actually woke me up because the house seemed silent, but I immediately realized my brother wasn't in his bed. My eyes widened, and I looked around the room while whispering his name. I felt protective of my brother, and I was very worried about him. I almost wanted to cry when I saw his jacket was missing. We had both hung it on the wardrobe door handle, but his jacket was gone. I grabbed my jacket and hurried down the stairs. There was a hallway. On one side was the front door, and on the other was the back door. Looking at the back door, the screen door was closed, but the door itself was open. I remember feeling scared, but more than anything, I wanted to make sure my little brother was okay. So I walked out into the backyard. I could see 2 figures, one big and one small. They seemed to be walking away from the house, but it was dark, and it was hard to tell. I walked a little closer, then gathered the courage to shout my brother's name. Both figures stopped for a moment, then the smaller one started running towards me. My brother ran into my arms, his eyes watery. I looked back up, and the other figure was still standing in the field looking towards us. I led my brother back inside and up to our bedroom. I asked what happened and what he was doing outside. All he said was he was scared of the dark, but Drew wanted to play a game. I didn't know what he meant, But I didn't care when I woke up at 6 years old and led them out in the middle of the night wasn't a good thing. I kept my little brother close for the rest of the holiday, but now I wish I had told someone about it. I was a shy kid who didn't want to be the center of attention about any drama, and I didn't think anyone would believe me, so I kept my mouth shut about it. It was a horrible Christmas, and I often think about it. Years later, I asked my brother what that man Drew did, but even now, he says he doesn't remember. He only remembers being scared. My cousin never brought him there again, so I assume everything didn't go well. I'm glad I saved my brother from whatever might have happened that night, but I remember it back and wish I could have done more. I lived in northern Canada at the time in a large cabin-style home. The holiday season was always my favorite time of year as my family gathered at one of our homes and celebrated Christmas together. Living alone, it was always something I looked forward to. I didn't mind being alone, but I enjoyed seeing some friends and family occasionally being at home. Our relatively small family often gathered at my house or my brother's house, usually taking turns each year. This year was my turn to host the family reunion. Most of my family lived on the other side of Canada, usually requiring a long journey or an expensive plane ride, although everyone tried to arrive on Christmas Eve. So on December 23rd, I called my brother to make sure everything was going as planned. He told me that our parents might arrive early on Christmas morning due to a flight delay, but he was driving and should arrive on Christmas Eve, hoping he would travel safely. I said goodnight and went back to sleep. Now, if you've ever lived in Canada, especially in the northern part, you know that winter is very cold and prolonged. Often snowstorms and snowstorms can form suddenly and last for varying periods, so the next day heavy snowfall covered the ground in the morning and accompanied by strong winds in the afternoon. Receiving a call from my brother around 6 p.m., informing me that he had to stay at a motel for the night because a snowstorm covered the road. I agreed that it was a safe decision, even though I was a little upset because I had to spend the day before Christmas alone. But I tried to stay positive, looking forward to Christmas Day with my whole family at 10 p.m. I got ready for bed and set the alarm earlier for 5 a.m. to be on guard. If my parents arrived at the airport early the next morning, the roaring wind outside the house made it difficult for me to sleep as it shook the entire room and made the whole house creak. But as I lay there annoyed and woke up, I heard a soft rhythmic sound approaching from outside the cabin, wind blowing in all directions randomly. Speed making the soft one becomes 2-foot steps. It was clearly visible. Very slow as expected in weather like this. But the footsteps continued until they reached the wall on the left side of my house. I just lay there with my eyes open, listening to this strange person walking during a snowstorm in the middle of the night. Many things crossed my mind, like total confusion and fear of possible attacks. But I started to wonder if it was my brother. Maybe something had happened and his phone didn't have service. Maybe he couldn't find a hotel. The more I thought about it, the more I felt I had to find a way to find out who that person was in weather like this. No one could survive more than an hour without serious consequences, and I clearly didn't want my brother and his family to get stuck there. As I put on heavier clothing, a knock came from below. The strange thing was, the knock was only once, and did not come from the front door. Hesitantly, I opened my bedroom door and peeked down the stairs. It was too dark to see anything, but I didn't want to reveal my position if it was someone dangerous, so I turned off my lamp. I walked blindly down the stairs, still listening to footsteps or any sound, but heard nothing but the strong wind. When I reached the bottom, I walked to the front door while the knock was not heard. It doesn't come from the front. I don't know what to do next. I'm not sure why, but that's when I really started to feel nervous. Scared even. Usually I don't say I'm easily scared, but there's something that feels very wrong. Approaching the door, silently I leaned forward and moved the small curtain on the window side. A man stood there looking at the door, looking calm and emotionless. But as he noticed me, he started shouting at me to help him, banging on the window while staring at my eyes. I jumped back unexpectedly as he started shouting. My heart started pounding in my chest. The man looked unhealthy as he seemed crazy, in one hand in his pocket like hiding something. I'm not comfortable at all to open it. Door, but I don't want to have it. The man is covered in blood on my hand because he didn't help him when the storm is like this. Hey, what's going on? How could you get here? I shouted. A few seconds break followed before the man answered calmly. I got lost. I just need a place to hide. His change in attitude worries me. I stand there thinking for a moment before the man asks me again to let him in, then again and again, becoming more aggressive with each word before starting to bang on the door repeatedly. I ran to another room to get my gun. I keep it in the case. Home defense. Then I returned to the front door, although I stood far enough away and remained defensive, hoping he would just leave if I ignored him. He continued pounding for over a minute, but as I stood there anxiously waiting, I heard footsteps again, walking around my house, now knowing that this was definitely a bad situation. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my room. I heard two men start talking immediately after that, followed by a window shattering and footsteps entering my house. The footsteps scattered downstairs. I heard objects moving and objects rattling before someone started climbing the stairs. My bedroom was the only room upstairs aside from a half bath, and a closet trembling uncontrollably and praying in my head. I raised my gun and pointed it at the door as a man approached. On the other side, yeah, he must be here, the man yelled almost gleefully. He punched the door once, although it sounded heavy as if he was hitting it with a hammer or even a gun. I could only flinch slowly. Of terror, the man laughed, chuckled. Then the other man below shouted something and both their footsteps disappeared. I sat there with my gun poised at the door for as long as 15 minutes, with nothing except the sound of wind blowing downstairs, cleaning the house carefully, making sure they were gone, then putting a small wooden board over the broken window so the snow wouldn't come in. The people had brought some valuables around the house and left a little mess, but no other damage had occurred. The snowstorm had subsided in the morning, and I told my family and the police about the incident. My brother was angry at himself for not accompanying me, but I assured him it was okay, and he made the right decision not to drive in the middle of a snowstorm, despite experiencing the most terrifying incident of my life. Throughout my life, I really enjoyed a very pleasant Christmas with my family. People at this time are cruel and terrible, and doing something like that to make someone experience something like that, especially during the holiday season, is just another level of madness.